So, one big difference of an audio story when it comes to versus written stories is how a good audio story can actually create a picture for the listener or the audience through what they're hearing. And yes, good written stories do help create those pictures as well, but audio stories allow the listener to hear and imagine a picture of the story, and like through the ambient noise that they're hearing, or if they hear something like a bird chirping, and it creates that better image. It's a better picture of like what is going on with the story, and you can hear it. So, and that helps the audience to actually have that in their head, like, oh, this is what I'm seeing in my head because I'm listening to it. So as opposed to written stories, I think it's harder to imagine the emotions and all those other pictures that the writer is trying to do or show through their writing. So I think audio stories are better in expressing those things and helping the audience get a better picture. And so that's one difference that I see from audio stories versus news stories or written stories. In terms of video and audio stories, the big difference is that the videos pretty much removes that imagination part of the audience, because the video pretty much shows you everything, shows you what's happening in the picture or in the story, and it gives you the audio already, and you don't really have to imagine anything when it comes to a video. So in a video, the audience pretty much sees what the story is about. The audience hears what the story is about. So there's nothing to imagine, there's nothing to use your creativity in your head and trying to picture that, because there's no need for it because video already shows it. So those, I think, are the most important differences between video written stories versus the audio stories. So I think, for the second question, I think what makes an audio stories compelling is the fact that good audio stories have to be able to stimulate the audience to the sense of hearing, and that's something that's really hard to do. And like for me personally, I've started listening to podcasts and audiobooks since they started to come out. I mean, pretty much stopped reading, but I do have some books that I do read from time to time. But I'm more interested on podcasts and audiobooks now because it allows me to soak in the information better when I hear it. And it's like, as opposed to like reading, when I'm reading it, it's just like sometimes I don't get it immediately. So when I read something, I was just like, oh, wait, I don't get that. So I gotta return the page back, and I'm just like, what was that about? And but when in audio stories, it's a lot easier for me to kind of like get the idea of the story by listening to it, because I feel like somebody's actually talking to me and telling me like, here's what's going on, and it's a lot easier to hear and understand. So I think when when you make audio stories, that it makes it more compelling than written stories, and the emotions from the voice or the tone of the person speaking actually helps the audience understand the story better. And in terms of challenges, I think that one challenge with audio stories is what we talk about on the videos and the book is location, and the other references showed it too, like location, because in an audio story you have to have the right ambient noise and the right location for recording, because just like music recording, like they have to go into the booth and record there so they can have the right audio that they wanted. So audio recording needs to have the right and specific feel to the background noise or the ambient noise, and picking the right location helps out with that. So I think that's one challenge that anybody that is going to record an audio story will face, because they have to make sure that the ambient noise matches the story that they're trying to tell, and picking the right location matches the story that they're trying to tell. So that's gonna be a little challenge that people will see and experience when they're recording their audio stories. But I think that's something that always that we need to always consider when it comes to creating audio stories. So, and the fourth question is talking about how to structure audio stories. One thing that I know is by doing interviews, stories, and well, basically how we're doing it in Blog Post 5 is how having the interviewee tell their story, and us as a journalist or the person who's the interviewer is going to be just structuring the questions in a way that allows the interviewee to express their thoughts and comments and ideas in full context, because this is the way where none of our personal recording as the interviewer is actually going to be included into the final product or final recording. So that's one way to do that. And then another way of structuring audio stories is creating podcast type stories. And I listen to Serial, and they talked about it in the book. And I also listen to all the Serial podcasts. And it's basically podcast stories or those kind of audio stories is doing interviews and also having the journalists talk about their comments and thoughts, and also show what the questions are, that the audience listen to the questions of the interviewer. So I think this way is a lot harder than everybody can imagine, because I think people think like just merging it, like putting a video, or not a video but a audio story together with just doing an interview and recording it is just that easy. But actually it's a lot harder, because the interviewer have to match all the audio with the interviewees, and also make sure that the audio have a good flow of story in between the interviewees, the interviewer, and the background sound and all that stuff. So it's a lot harder to merge all that and make them flow in a good story. So that's something that I wanted to learn, really, because I do want to do my own podcast someday, but I don't know if I'll have the time to do it, but we'll see. But yeah, so that's another way of structuring audio stories is doing podcast type stories. Um, so for the last question, how can journalists actually bring in more audience? I think because we are now in a digital world, not every audience can actually sit down and read your story. They don't have the time to read the written stories with this new digital world we have. I mean, the competition of having people read a published written article or something on the internet that is a news story on the internet, like a lot of people can't do that anymore. So a lot of people are moving away from reading written articles, and I know it's hard because there are journalists that are there are still newspapers that publishes newspapers or magazines that you can still read. But at the end of the day, because this is a developing digital world, a journalist should be able to both do audio stories and news stories, because that's how you're going to gather the audience that are not able, like the busy audience who are not able to actually read a story and sit down and not drive or not do anything besides read a story. So I think journalists can bring in their audience if they do audio stories as well, because you can actually gather people who's like, oh, I'm working out, so I can still just listen to this audio story and find out what's going on with the news. And then at the same time, you have people who are driving, going to work, and usually not everybody have the time when they get to work to actually sit down and, hey, I'm gonna read a magazine or I'm gonna read a newspaper. So I think one way to do that, one way to bring audience more into for journalists is actually to have audio stories, because audio stories will allow you to have those audience who doesn't have the time to read the story that you would write. So yeah, I think that's one way of doing that, and that's how journalists can actually use audio stories to gather more audience. And that's all my answer for this activity.